20XX was a game that I featured on this channel and reviewed in a very positive light. As a Megaman X inspired roguelike, it felt nearly perfect with a ton of replayability and content to boot. When I heard of 30XX and its eventual release on early access, I wanted to review it right away. Unfortunately, I really was not a fan of where the game was at the time and felt it needed a bit more time to give it a better chance. After a little over 2 years in early access, is it finally worth a purchase? To make sure that I go into this game as a first time player, I had to reset my save data. The game starts off in a tutorial and you cannot die in this tutorial, but it definitely does give you a taste of what is yet to come. So you start off playing as Ace in the tutorial, which is the melee user, sword user, and different weapons that he can acquire, and later get to play as Nina, who is the main ranged user, basically 0 and X respectively. The game recommends a controller and I do so as well. The game just feels perfect using an Xbox 360 controller, and it basically retains the same control scheme from the prior game, which was definitely not broken, so there was no need to fix it. Honestly, it's just a very good tutorial that does a great job introducing you to the controls without taking up too much time. And before we get more into like the gameplay and all that stuff, we should go talk about the new graphical style. And honestly, when I first saw this in the trailers, I was a bit hesitant to embrace the change. And the reason why is because it was just so zoomed up in the trailers and just ultimately didn't look good. But I honestly was worried for nothing because this game looks absolutely vibrant and gorgeous, especially compared to 20XX. This is far away the graphically superior game in every which way. The colors and backgrounds especially are such a huge step up. My only complaint is just how overly busy some of the segments can be, especially for boss battles. There's one boss battle in particular where it's raining and it's just hard to tell what can hit you and what can't. And it just makes it hard to tell what's going on without experiencing some sort of sensory overload. And the soundtrack is also excellent as expected, so not much to talk about there. So once you do complete the tutorial, you can pick the standard or mega mode. And the standard mode is the standard 20XX permadeath mode, while Mega mode does not. And funny that I mentioned Mega Man right there, because it's basically just that. You know, you go through the levels, pick the next boss and lever you want to tackle, and go from there. So I stuck mainly with the standard mode for my playthrough, so that's what we'll be talking about there. And afterwards, you're brought to the main hub after you make your choice, and you can purchase permanent upgrades here, pick your character, attempt daily and weekly challenges, view leaderboards, start up a co-op game, add some difficulty modifiers, explore the place, or just start the damn game already. Honestly, I really like the way this hub world is designed from both an aesthetic and standpoint and a design standpoint. Way better than what was in 20XX, and honestly I just enjoy messing around and exploring the place and seeing what I can find. So similar to 20XX, the first level is chosen at random for you and is basically procedurally generated. Early on I have several issues with the new level design, and compared to the original it's far more linear. I mean, 20XX obviously was linear, you have to go from left to the right, but here it's a lot more. The reason why is because it's just way more restricted. Like before, you could find a high spot and skip some of the very intimidating parts. It wasn't possible on all levels, but it can still something you can attempt. Here it's very confined and feels very claustrophobic. The second issue just comes down to how often these level sections repeat. The top right displays the part that's being used, and honestly I see the same used very often, and I'm pretty sure that there's going to be more pieces to be added to spice up the levels, but no foreseeable altercations on the structures of the level now, which is just a big issue for me. And within the levels there is a subpar selection of augments to find throughout the levels. You can get these from defeating enemies, opening chests, completing challenges, and buying from the shop, and I'm fine with the way you obtain them. I have no issues with that, but most of these are just pretty weak and far too often repeat themselves. Too many revolve around increasing certain stats while lowering others, so it's very hard to really find a good build without being too extreme on what it ultimately becomes. So this brings us to the core section, and I'm really just not a fan of what they've done here. So basically you have a limited amount of points that can be used on what cores you can have currently equipped on you. So that includes the leg parts, the body parts, head parts that were done similarly, similar to those power-ups that you can find there. So unless you're able to increase your core amount from getting other augments or just from the permanent upgrades, this means that you can only have certain core pieces to fit under the limit. Even when you increase it, there's still only a finite number that you'll get. So this really limits experimentation and gives the players just far less agency on builds that they can create. And honestly, the game should just adopt the Lego system and let us build what we want, you know. Everything could use some more Legos. That's all I gotta say. All right, I'm done. Levels now feature both sub-bosses and main bosses, and defeating these will grant you memorial to use at the hub, as well as main bosses, allowing you to choose a power-up afterwards and proceed to the next level. And this is where you really start to see the balancing is all over the place. I mean, you do see it with the regular enemies, but mainly for the bosses, because some of these sub-bosses are way harder than the actual main bosses, and others are just way too easy. Like some of the sub bosses are just way too easy, and it's almost a joke to get past them. So honestly, most of the time my deaths usually come when facing a sub or main boss, which I think is intentional for the game, but it just seems like a lot of these bosses are very overtuned, and some of the normal enemies are kind of undertuned, if that makes sense. So they're definitely going to need to do some polishing. And it could be a quirk of early access, but still kind of an annoyance to deal with. And honestly, lack of balance is really just the biggest issue with this game. Just everything feels unbalanced, imbalanced, you know, whatever term you want to use. And honestly, most of this actually just stems from the characters themselves. Because Nina has a ranged option and can avoid getting close in many situations, while Ace has to get very, very close outside of a few select weapons. There are better weapons that you can obtain for him that give you a bit more flexibility, but for the most part, you do have to get close. There is also a power that you can obtain to throw your weapon with Ace, but it's not really something you can do as that takes up your energy. So I've beaten 20XX with Ace before, so this honestly shouldn't be a problem in theory, but it's just many enemies will attack you if you get too close, while Nina could just avoid certain situations altogether just from her range alone. It just seems like they really have to just look at these characters and see how to best build the levels around them, specifically for Ace, because they've done a few reworks for Ace already throughout the development cycle. So I would say this is probably his best iteration yet. But even so, some of the enemies are just very hard for him. And I know once I reach certain sub bosses or main bosses, it's just going to be a health sink because of how hard and how difficult it is to take out some of these bosses. But sometimes it's almost like this game just wants to be hard for the sake of be hard, because there's not just what I'm saying, the normal difficulty that you can play through and go through and how it gets harder as you go through the levels, but you can also do things to make the game even more challenging. One thing you can do is you can increase the difficulty manually from the hub, as mentioned prior. And there's also glory runs, which make the level harder in exchange for an augment. Most of these augments are just not worth it. I did this once, and for what I had to go through and the reward, definitely not worth it. So I did mention co-op before, and it's for both online and couch co-op. And I honestly was able to play couch co-op with a friend of mine, and honestly just had just as much fun as I did with the co-op in 20XX. Probably slightly more fun just of how we were struggling together, you know, trying to overcompensate for each other. So that was a lot of fun. I really like the dynamic of both Nina and Ace together, because they really do complement each other when there's certain enemies. Because as I did mention, Ace is the harder character to play with, but there are certain bosses that he may, or certain enemies that he may have the advantage over compared to Nina in certain situations. So I really like that dynamic. But just know that the game is unfortunately harder in co-op just because of the scaling of bosses is a little ridiculous. Bosses that aren't too hard in the just going through single, honestly feel like freaking marathons, and it goes on for way too long. Again, this game just needs a whole rebalancing of health and everything, and we'll get to more of that when I finally conclude this video. So one of the big things I like to look at when it comes to early access is the dev support. Updates come in pretty regularly, so I wouldn't really worry about that. The main menu also displays a timer when the next update will launch, which is very much appreciated. And honestly, more games in early access should just continue to be, more and more transparent to their customers. And this, I think, is another great example of an early access game that's very transparent with people who buy it, with their supporters. So much appreciated, no issues there. So overall, my final thoughts, it's a very difficult game to state an overall opinion on, because for one side, the core concept of 20XX is retained, of it being a very Mega Man X inspired game with roguelike elements. The graphics are also well improved, and the soundtrack still kicks ass. It may actually be a little bit better than what was in 20XX, certainly more tracks in this one. My main concern though is just with the whole unbalanced and unpolished nature of it all. The levels designs is just far more restricted and way less room for experimentation. And I've definitely had my fun with 30XX, I will not lie about that. But I've just had so many frustrations with what I keep discovering. I can recommend it for those who crave a challenging 2D platforming gameplay, as well as a Mega Man X inspired gameplay and with a bit of a twist. But for everyone else, it's going to be a hard sell, especially for the level of difficulty and just the unpolished nature of it all. I can recommend 20XX instead, as that is far more accessible and enjoyable experience for me, while still being challenging. And it also retains many of the things I mentioned here, like daily challenges, weekly challenges, co-op challenges, and also 2 other characters you can get for DLC. So overall, I'd recommend 20XX right now, especially since it's complete, over 30XX. But who knows, maybe when 30XX is released, it becomes the superior title, but only time can tell. Anyways, thank you guys for watching as always, and this is Powerhouse, signing off.